session. Um, we're going to record this session, so if you're okay with that, that's great. If you're not okay with that, then feel free not to participate. We're also going to have a Q&A session at the end, which will be basically based on the chat option. So use that chat option on your computer in Zoom. If you get any problems, just let us know. But at any point in the presentations, please put in your questions. And at the end of this session, with about 10 minutes to go, we'll start to look at how we can compile answers to that from specialists who will be presenting, myself or others who can talk about it. Now, everybody, just as a courtesy, please leave video off and mute so that we can just have the presentations, and then we can have the Q&A versus the chat function. And that's basically the structure for the day. The recording, the materials, documents that we talk about in here will be all packaged up and sent to participants. And obviously grateful for feedback. If we don't get your question today, by all means, we can follow up with you later as well. And if you get any issues or comments from this session or want to follow up, then you can contact us at general@newautomotive.org. That's general@newautomotive.org. And we'll put that in the links as well. Okay, so I will stop now. And I will pass to our first presenter, who is David Farrar, who's going to talk us through some of the content of this material and about New Automotive's activities and its current products.
Exactly, over to me. I'm Corin.
Oh, sorry, Corin. Sorry, my mistake. Over to Corin, who's going to take us through the first part of this.
Cool. So I'm a data analyst in automotive, and I just want to first give us a bit of a background as to why we focus on cars and why we're expanding globally beyond our current scope of the UK. So transport has been the sort of biggest contributing sector to CO2 emissions in the UK since 2017. In 2019, 27% of greenhouse gases emissions in the UK came from transport, while transport as a whole made up 22% of CO2 emissions globally. In this context, it was clear that change was needed, and BEVs are a good answer to this problem, essentially. In addition to this, over the past 10 years, we've seen that electricity generation in the UK has been on a steady march away from coal, with coal expected to be phased out by 2025. This decline in coal has been made up for using predominantly green technologies, such as wind, solar, and bioenergy. You can see the charts on the right from Ember, highlighting this change. The decline of coal, being the most carbon intense fuel, has meant that the sort of electricity generation has become a less CO2 intensive process in the UK, and this is something that's slowly creeping out worldwide as well. So at a certain point, the question becomes, well, what do we do with this carbon saving? And we come with the answer that electrification of the average UK car can save about 1.1 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour of green electricity, which is quite a significant saving, so much so that it's a bigger saving than you would see from switching an old gas boiler to a heat pump or switching to a fuel cell electric vehicle current. So why expand the scope outside of the UK? Following the successful implementation of the zero emissions vehicle mandate in the UK, we wish to carry this success forward onto a more global stage. Across the globe, battery electric vehicles are becoming increasingly significant share of the car market. This is why it's more important than ever to understand the rate of global uptake, as well as the impacts of policy on registrations, which allows us to develop increasingly more tried and tested policy suggestions. A significant part of our mission thus far in the UK has been to counter misconceptions, misinformation, and disinformation that we've seen. One example of this is that recently we've seen heavy stories of how BEVs are in decline, that the momentum has gone away, and no one is interested in electric cars anymore. However, we can see from Q1 of this year alone, we've reached the third greatest number of new registrations in the UK, and we expect this to continue, especially in hand with the introduction of the ZEV mandate. Developing a historical understanding of the car markets more globally allows us to add more nuance to the conversation. This gives us an understanding of where we come from, where we're going, and it allows us to then look past seasonality or monthly trends and look more at the long-term scope and how markets have evolved and learning from these changes in other markets. So which countries are included in the global electric vehicle tracker? At the minute, we have countries from Asia, including China, India, Japan, Singapore, Thailand, and Turkey. The Americas, including Brazil, Chile, and the US. Australasia, including Australia, which is quarterly data, and New Zealand monthly. Europe, we have the EU27, as well as Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and UK. This gives us 42 countries in total, with 41 of these being monthly. And we estimate this to be around 80 to 85% coverage of the car market across the globe. So what do we publish? We'll be publishing fuel type data for each individual country, as well as manufacturer data where available. I want to hand over to David to discuss the data for Q1.
Thanks, Corinne. Hi everyone, I'm the Policy and Research Manager, and I'll take you through the data from the first quarter. Just to be clear, in the whole of this session, when I'm talking about battery electric vehicles or EVs, I'm talking about pure electric vehicles, and that excludes vehicles like plug-in hybrid electric vehicles or other hybrids, which is in contrast to the International Energy Agency's Global EV Outlook published this morning, which lumped together PHEVs, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and battery electric vehicles. Our rationale for that is simply that PHEVs, plug-in hybrids, still produce tailpipe emissions, and the recent research by the European Commission has shown that real-world emissions of plug-ins are much higher, by a factor of about 3.5 times those achieved in test conditions. So on the long view, this slide is really showing us that sales of battery electric cars are still increasing in the vast majority of markets. And in some markets, they're increasing extremely fast. Of the 39 countries for which we have 2 years of sales, Corinne mentioned 41, but we don't have 2 years worth of data from Turkey and Singapore. For 37 of those 39, the volume of battery electric cars in the battery electric car sales in the year to March 2024 is up on the preceding 12 months. The only two in which it's down, which you can see in the bottom right, are Croatia and Norway. Croatia is a really small market, only buying about 5,000 new cars of any kind a month, whilst Norway has seen falls in vehicle sales of all types. And the decline in battery electric car sales is actually lower than every other vehicle type, including petrol, diesel, and hybrids. So they're still seeing increasing market share. Meanwhile, EV sales are rising in other markets. So 26 markets in our sample, which is the whole of the left-hand column, and the first 7 of the right-hand column, saw increases of more than 25% a year, whilst 14 markets saw rises of more than 50% over the past year on the previous 12 months. Generally, what we'd expect is the pace of growth slows as adoption increases. So many of the countries with the fastest growth rate are relatively early in that journey. That includes countries like Thailand and Brazil, which each saw battery electric sales more than double. But that isn't uniformly the case. Countries like Belgium, Denmark, Portugal, Finland all had a significant EV market share in 2022, but sales have increased by more than 50% over the past 12 months. In the past 12 months versus the previous ones. And countries which have historically been laggards, such as the USA, have seen sales increase 38%, whilst in Australia, sales have more than doubled. But I guess I should emphasize that this is a quarterly briefing. And if you just only focus on comparing the last 12 months with the previous 12 months, you could end up potentially missing some more recent trends. So let's take a moment to look at sales on a quarterly basis. Next slide. Thanks, Corinne. So here are sales by continent on a quarterly basis, as promised. Just to remind again, we're not covering every market here. We don't yet have any African markets, for instance, in scope, so they're not shown. But we are capturing more than 80% of new car sales globally. First thing to emphasize then is we've continued to have lots of reports of battery electric car sales slowing, fading, stalling falling, slumping, or collapsing, depending on how you look at it, depending on the your media outlet of choice. And it's true there has been a quarter-on-quarter decline in sales in 2020, in the first quarter of 2024, but there was a similar quarterly decline in sales in Q1 of 2023, where you can see a dip from Q4 2022 to Q1 of 2023, with sales bouncing back strongly in the subsequent quarters and then hitting all-time record levels of 3.2 million sales by Q4 of 2023 of last year. 2023, which was last year. Total EV sales are down in Q1, but they're only down to 2.2 million, which is still more than 15% up on the same quarter last year. And you can see a similar pattern in the year before that. In 2022, the lowest reported EV sales were in Q1. They then increased steeply through quarters 2, 3, and 4 of that year. So we may well, as with so many kind of dire stories about EV sales, be actually mistaking a seasonal trend, a dip, as you progress from Q4 to Q1 of the subsequent year, for a secular shift. The drivers of the decline, if we compare the columns for Q4 2023 and Q1 of 24, are most obviously in Asia. We can see that green bar has declined in size, and to a lesser extent in Europe. And there are 2 countries that are largely responsible for that, as we'll come on to. But it's worth noting that total sales of battery electric cars in the past 4 quarters for the markets that we cover are 10.4 million, which is already up on the figure that the IEA quoted for all 4 quarters of 2023, and also in contrast to a recent article in the Times of London, which suggested that 10 million sales won't be reached until 2025. In fact, the 10 million mark has already been exceeded for battery electric vehicles globally. The next chart shows evolving trends in the market share of battery electric cars over the same period. So we're showing market share rather than total volume. Market share of EVs largely held up in the kind of 7 to 8% range in Oceania, or Australasia, as you wish, so New Zealand and Australia, and the Americas. But in Q1, but it also fell back in Asia and Europe, as I've alluded to, just as it fell back in Q1 of 2023. So whilst I don't have a crystal ball on this, it's premature to assume that it will be different this time, and we're looking at something that isn't purely seasonal. So now let's take a dive into Europe. We mentioned that overall EV sales slowed in Q1 in Europe, and this slide unpacks that data a little. Before I do that, it's also worth noting that EV sales in Q4 2023 were down on the same quarter in 2022, which again led to a sprinkling of doomsaying reports. But sales in Q4 2022 were exceptionally high, and sales in all the other quarters of 2023 were significantly up on the corresponding quarters in 2022. Turning back to the most recent quarter, battery electric sales increased very marginally from 399,000 in Q1 of 2023 to 402,000 in Q1 of 2024. They actually went up in the UK, in France, and in the Benelux countries. They fell in the Nordics, but again, sales of other fuel types actually fell faster. So we still saw increasing market share in those countries. The main driver of the EV slowdown in Europe, and the first of the countries which has really accounted for the slowdown, was falling sales in Germany, which declined from 95,000 in Q1 of 2023 to 81,000 in Q1 of 2024. This is almost entirely, we believe, a result of the immediate withdrawal of incentives in December 2023, following a budget crisis that was caused by a decision in the courts that the German government wasn't able to deploy COVID recovery funds to a climate transformation fund, and that included corresponding hits to EV subsidies. And predictably, this led to sales falling off a cliff in the first quarter of 2024. And the top column there shows declining, shows the distribution of EV sales over time, EVs being the green bar at the bottom, and other vehicle types making up the blue, beige, brown, and grey colours. If there's a surefire way of making your domestic market tank, it's normally the sudden withdrawal of incentives. Germany has now seen this at least twice. We had a similar fall in sales following the announced reduction in incentives in 2023, which led to a flurry as buyers beat the phase down. We then got a post-cut lull and a gradual recovery through the rest of 2023, only to slump again in 2024 as a result of the budget crisis. It's a fairly straightforward bit of behavioral economics that consumers will make a buying decision based not only on the value of the goods on offer, but what they could or would have paid previously. So a 25% off sticker, for instance, is always going to attract more interest than a 25% on sticker, even if the two products are exactly the same price today. We can definitely hope for a recovery in Germany, but it does sometimes take a while. Italy's EV market looked like it was on the verge of taking off in late 2021, but a long period with no incentives, which I've marked with the circle there, hammered sales through the first half of 2022, and they've yet to completely recover, despite having incentives in place for the past 18 months or so. Sales are still stuck around that 4% mark. And here as a counterpart is an interesting example of the UK. UK phased out its EV incentives quite elegantly in stages between 2020 and 2022, although it did in the process leave the market slightly unbalanced with all the incentives on company vehicles and not on private sales. However, the Prime Minister's announcement in September 2023, which I've tried to circle there, pushed the end date for sales of new internal combustion engine vehicles back from 2030 to 2035. And that may have had an impact, even if in practice the policy change was very limited. For people not familiar with the UK market, all it really did was permitted petrol and diesel cars to be included in a small proportion of non-battery electric cars, which could be bought in 2030, alongside plug-in hybrid vehicles, which were the only vehicles that previously had the government had envisaged being available alongside battery electric cars. So there's no blip visible in the market share shown, but if you trace back to previous years, you can see it customarily in 2020, 2021 and 2022, there had always been a big surge in battery electric vehicles in the last month or two of the year. That annual surge never happened in 2023, and that could have been a result of the Prime Minister's announcement, or it could equally have been the arrival of the UK zero emissions vehicle mandate, which incentivised car manufacturers to push back sales into early 2024. Or indeed, it could have been last-minute uncertainty about trade negotiations between Britain and the EU on rules of origin for EVs. This is sometimes what the game is like, is trying to read the runes to understand the reasons for changes that did happen or the changes that didn't. In the interest of time, because we have a lot of European markets, I'm not going to offer a country-by-country update on these markets, but this slide provides a bit of an update on where we are on the adoption curve, which is at least one way of thinking about the rollout of electric car technology. So with about 83% annual sales being EVs now, Norway, over towards the right-hand side between the conservatives and the skeptics kind of segments of the population, has pretty much completed its journey up the adoption curve and is now over the peak. It's now entering that final kind of skeptics phase of the cycle, whilst a little further back with about 49% EV sales, Iceland is through the early majority and about to begin that late majority group. Many countries are well into the hard yards of the early majority kind of car buying population, including Denmark and Sweden, which are in the high 30s of percentage sales, Finland, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, which are in the low 30s, and Switzerland and Belgium, which are in the low 20s. And there's also a whole bunch of countries which have kind of leapt the chasm and now have a toehold in the early majority, with between 17 and 20% of their sales being EVs. That includes France, Germany and the UK, as well as Portugal, Ireland and Malta. Finally, further back in that visionary section, so starting from the far left, there are three interesting countries quickly to flag here, which are making inroads. Romania, which has 11% of sales over the past 12 months, although it recently rolled back its incentives perhaps a little too swiftly, whilst Latvia and Slovenia both have 9% sales over the past 12 months. The two biggest lagging markets are Spain with 5% market share and Italy with just 4%. But also, just finally, sorry to flag, is Hungary, which I haven't shown here, but is just coming through in the most recent month, had hit 9% EV monthly sales. Not normally a country that you'd expect to be amongst the vanguard of early adopters, but it is making successful and significant efforts to attract BEV battery electric vehicle manufacturers to the country, and that's showing in sales. Thanks. Now we'll turn to Asia. So I mentioned at the beginning that Asia was largely responsible for the drop in sales of EVs, and this slide pretty much explains what's happening. And as always, it's probably in the battery electric vehicle market, China is happening. EV sales did dip significantly in Q1 of 2024, and they were particularly low in January and February before bouncing back last month. But again, it's not obvious that this is really a cause for concern. There were similar dips in Q1 of 2021, in Q1 of 2022, and in Q1 of 2023, and each time the market bounced back higher. If you adjust for these seasonal variations by plotting a 12-month rolling average, which is the dotted line there, you can see a pretty consistent rise. Average monthly battery electric sales are above 550,000 a month now. That's a slightly reduced incline in the past couple of months, but that's also visible in 2023 too. So again, we appear to be mistaking seasonal variations for a global slowdown. And any slowdown is not really detectable in market share. You can see here where BEVs are again at the green line, showing market share over time. Sales of all fuel types dip in China in the early months of the year, so battery electric market share is holding up well, now at more than 26%, just as it has done in other years. We've had similar dire warnings about Tesla sales, and it's worth spending a moment to kind of consider how merited those concerns are. They're probably more merited than the concerns about EV sales as a whole. The chart shows Tesla sales in a variety of markets there. So with the bars representing sales in different countries and the orange thick line showing the kind of rolling average of Tesla sales. We don't have, this is just in a sample of markets, we don't have any manufacturer data for some countries, and the US is one of the markets that's missing. But this gives you a sense of the outlook. The first thing to note is that Tesla sales in Europe are pretty small compared with China. They're not quite a rounding error, but in volume terms, Europe is not a big market. The second thing to note is that while Tesla has seen similar slow periods in the past, this one has been going on for quite a long time, and it doesn't really appear to be seasonal anymore. Looking at the 12-month rolling average, sales haven't really broken out that 90 to 95,000 per month range since the summer of last year. Their sales aren't really falling in absolute terms, but as we've talked about, this is a global market where total sales of EVs are increasing, and that means that Tesla is seeing a reduced market share over time. And you can see this by looking at Tesla sales in China in particular, which is probably its biggest market. It's definitely been squeezed from falling from more than 22% in 2021 to 14% today, so a fall of more than a third in market share. The other things that are interesting to note in the chart is how fast moving the Chinese EV market really is, with Wuling moving from the 4th largest manufacturer to 4th place in 3 years, although Guangzhou Automobile Group who own Wuling, also own Ion, so there's a compensating rise there. There are many smaller market participants too, and it's also interesting to note that the major Chinese exporters to Europe, SAIC and Geely, as owners of MG and Volvo respectively, aren't even in the top 10 players in China today. Another concern being expressed about China is its vehicle exports, obviously, amid allegations of unfair competition and hostile technologies. This chart shows market share of Chinese-owned brands in a selection of European EV markets. Figures like 25% get bandied around as the market share of Chinese EVs in Europe, but that actually includes European and US-owned brands which are manufactured in China. So if we're talking about state aid considerations and subsidies for them, then it would be EU and US makers who are benefiting from those. If we look at just Chinese-owned firms alone, then we see Geely, as I mentioned, who own Volvo, and also Polestar and SAIC are the only really significant participants right now, and they account for around 75% of sales. BYD has grown through 2023 and early 2024, but its market share currently remains extremely low, and NIO, Aura and Chery are even lower than that. And finally, I guess we should remember that other countries are available in Asia, and we should zoom out from China and actually take a quick look at other markets. What's visible here is that Thailand, India, and Turkey, which are down towards the bottom of the graph but growing sharply, are all really starting to see takeoff. We're comparing their EV sales here just with 3 representative European markets in the chart. It's pretty clear that all 3 of those have now overtaken markets like Italy, with more than 6,000 sales per month, and they each appear to be on course to overtake the Netherlands, which is the 4th largest EV market in Europe, sometime later this year There's some way to go to overtake the biggest three markets in the UK, France, and Germany, which each have around 25,000 sales per month. But it's clear that manufacturers really can't overlook these markets. And if we become Fortress Europe by shutting out foreign cars, we also risk losing access to foreign markets, both through things like retaliatory trade measures and through a general loss of competitiveness. The US has definitely tried protectionism in the past in car manufacturing, and it hasn't tended to end very well on occasions. If it results in higher transport costs for consumers and business, it won't just be our car markets that suffer. The effects will kind of percolate through to every other sector of the economy too. So we'll briefly cover the Americas. Currently, our sample only does include the US and Brazil. We're awaiting data from Chile, which Corinne mentioned, but we're planning to add that and other countries in due course. So firstly, on the topic of the US, we can see that the continual tales of slowdown and doom are somewhat overstated again, with very few exceptions. Battery electric sales in each month of the year are an increase on the corresponding month in previous years. So to unpack that a little bit, if we look at January, sales in 2024, over on the right-hand end of that cluster of bars in January, is that bar is higher than all previous bars. So sales in January 2024 exceeded all previous Januaries. And it's a similar pattern for February and for March. And it's, with very rare exceptions, it's the case for the rest of the year, looking at 2023's data. This is a pretty good result, especially when you consider the restrictions on tax credits that were introduced in the US at the beginning of 2024. Battery electric vehicle sales exceeded 100,000 in March of 2024, only the fifth time they've done so, and the first time they've done so in the first 5 months of the year. And turning to Brazil, it's a pretty similar picture there to what we saw with Thailand, Turkey, and India, a rapidly rising market. I've shown Brazil on a non-rolling basis here, just to draw out the very rapid rise in EV sales we've seen from the second half of 2023 onwards. Indeed, in March 2024, sales were up 900% on the same month last year, reaching an all-time high. EV sales again look like they've overtaken Spain and Italy, and if this trend continues, then Brazil will be larger than all European markets except Germany, France, and the UK in the near future. And finally, a few words on Australia and New Zealand. Australia has seen rapid growth, that's the blue line there, since the election of the Labour government replacing the Liberal National Coalition in May 2022. Market share of EVs has grown from 3% to 9%, but it's yet to kind of break out beyond early adopters. There's still a way to go there. And New Zealand, obviously very volatile sales there because it's an import-based industry, is another poster child for somewhat chaotic withdrawal of incentives following the victory of the National Coalition in November of last year. An announced end to discounts on EVs took effect at the end of the year, which inevitably triggered a huge surge and then a subsequent collapse in the market. Sales are now back to where Australia was at the beginning of 2022, and there'll be a while coming back. So finally, just end with a quick summary of what we've seen in Q1. Long-term sale trends in EV sales continue to go sharply upwards, especially in emerging economies, but not limited to those. The slide in Q1 EV sales on Q4 levels is almost wholly due to lower sales in China, which is an expected seasonal effect. The Chinese market is continuing to grow in respect of EVs, but Tesla sales in China are being squeezed by increasing competition, and that's led to total sales leveling off since summer of 2023. The slowdown in relation to EVs in the US has been overstated. Adjusting for seasonal factors, sales are continuing to consistently rise. And then sales in India, Turkey, Thailand, as well as Brazil, growing extremely fast, set to exceed most European countries' markets by the end of the year. 15 European countries have now reached EV market share of more than 16%, taking them beyond the early adopters stage on the technology adoption life cycle. But the recent withdrawal of incentives has hit EV sales in Germany and also obviously outside Europe, New Zealand, particularly hard. I think I'll hand over to Neha.
Hi, so I also work as a data analyst for New Automotive, and I'm going to quickly take you through the data collection process. So as you can probably imagine, ensuring access to reliable data from various countries is pivotal to the success of the global EV tracker. To achieve this, we've devised an approach that involves leveraging freely available sources. Typically, these sources comprise data provided by government agencies. However, in cases where such data is not available, we resort to information supplied by other reputable entities, such as transport agencies or automotive companies. As Corinne already touched on, the data we aim to obtain includes new passenger car registrations by month, split by fuel type and make if available. We have scheduled jobs that are executed on the second Monday of each month. These jobs encompass the collection, cleaning, and aggregation of data for each country, which is subsequently uploaded to our databases. Additionally, we meticulously map fuel types between countries to ensure consistency and uniformity across our datasets. If for any reason data is unavailable during these scheduled runs, we attempt to retrieve it in the following days. We acknowledge there are risks associated with retrieving data from the sources that we use, which is why we are actively working to establish backup data to mitigate any disruptions should certain sources become unexpectedly unavailable. To collect the information needed for the country profiles, we conduct an assessment of reliable sources for each country. These include government agencies, industry associations, reputable news organizations, and independent research organizations. Once identified, we review each country's transition and challenges in BEV sales and manufacturing. And from this analysis, we craft concise 100 to 150 word summaries, which you can see alongside the data in the tracker. I think now it's back to Corinne.
Lovely, thank you. So the question now is where do we go next? Ideally, we'd love to reach 100% global coverage. So naturally, always looking to collect further data from countries we don't currently hold data on, expanding the data that we do currently have. As I alluded to earlier, we wish to learn from what does and doesn't work so that we can use the information to drive effective policy. We also want to be able to look at country comparisons to understand uptake patterns and use this to provide meaningful projections to the transition in other countries. We'll also be releasing an interactive dashboard, which will give people like yourself, as well as others wishing to learn more about the transition, quick access to real-world data as and when it's released. So finally, thanks for joining us. If there are questions that you don't want to drop in the chat or come up later when you think about this presentation or when we send over the slides and any additional data later on, feel free to drop us an email at general@newautomotive.org. I'll now hand back over to Harry to lead the Q&A. So feel free to raise any questions in the chat box.
Thanks, Corinne. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for that presentation. Great stuff. As we put on the chat there, we're really looking forward to questions on the day. We have had a few questions ahead of the webinar prompted by the topic, which we will start to go through. We've only got about 10 minutes, but that's what we'll do. But just maybe give 30 seconds for some questions to come in now that people have digested, and we're getting questions coming in now. So if you just give us, let's just leave it another 30 seconds or so for us to digest some of the questions coming in, and we'll respond to them. And for any questions we don't get to today, as Corinne mentioned there, we'll get back to you from the website, and if you send them into our the general newautomotive.org email address. So we will follow up on these even if we don't get through them in the next few minutes. Okay, I'm just going to look through these. I'll try and moderate them, and if you'll allow me, I'll pass to my colleagues unless I can answer them directly myself. Okay, we've got a question about countries with low subsidies or no subsidies that are seeing growth, and
I think we might have to take that away for some further examples, but there certainly are
Sure,
which
sure.
there certainly are some. I think Finland is one that comes to mind that, as far as we have been able to establish, doesn't have any buyer subsidies, but does continue to have high levels of growth. And I think there could well be others in Europe. I think sometimes it's a bit of a myth that's been put out by by incumbent interests in certain markets. I guess I mean the UK. Sometimes that no country is seeing growth unless it has significant subsidies. For instance, a VAT reduction, which has been called for by the SMMT at the moment. I don't think that's the case, and there are some markets where sales are continuing to rise. But we can certainly supply a fuller answer in writing on that. But Finland is definitely one that we're cited on.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, David's right there. I think over time you're seeing subsidies kind of being removed anyway. So the answer might be most countries are now more mainstream adoption. So subsidies are becoming less. As David points out, the price parity between EVs and the ICE equivalents are getting closer and closer. The IEA mentioned that today in their, especially in China, where actually EVs are cheaper than ICE cars across most segments. So you see a bit of the future there. So I think subsidies have been a great pump primer, but going forward, it's probably the cars themselves are looking to be much more effective. We've got a question here about question about whether we've seen sales go up or down, and do we actually does New Automotive do predictions of what sales are likely to be? I'm possibly going to pass that to either David or Corin to say that obviously one of the things we've tried to point out here is that they're very seasonal. So you really need to take rolling averages as your basis of measurement. Month to month, there's a lot of noise versus the signal of the underlying trend. So one of the things we'd hope to push out here is to say that on a trend basis, a rolling average basis, a seasonal basis, then you see a strong trend upwards, and therefore, but you get newspapers and social media reacting very quickly on a day-to-day basis, and you can be flooded with everybody's hot take. But I don't know whether David or Corin would want to comment about that in terms of where we see the trends going.
I suppose I'd say it's certainly something that we'll consider. I think my hesitancy is sometimes we've already have the kind of noise that every time there's a seasonal drop off in sales and it turns into a kind of EV sales are slowing story. The danger is that if you end up making predictions that the market will grow by 20% and it only grows by 15%, that itself becomes an item of bad news, which actually sets aside the fact that the market share is still significantly increasing. But certainly it's something that we'll think about and look at. And there's another really interesting point, I think, from I can't find now who raised the question, but there was a point about the linkage between incentives and sales boosts and sales drop-offs, and that is definitely something that we're actively looking at doing. As Harry talked about, the phasing out of incentives needs to be handled quite carefully, and there are examples of that being done well, and there are examples of that being done less well, and so I think that's probably a useful tool for policymakers, is to try and give an idea about the kind of ideal rates and the ideal stages at which incentives are removed from the market, and I suppose no prizes for guessing that probably in steps is the best way rather than in one fell swoop.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of just offer my agreement with David in that as well. I think also it's a good opportunity to plug that we do have a mailing list for our global EV tracker, where we publish some monthly data, which is a platform that we have that we can discuss sort of changes in public policy in countries and sort of speculate how the effects of those things. But naturally, the car market is very much a stochastic market, and therefore there is always a degree of chaos that means these things can't be perfectly predicted. But we do very much like, certainly at least even just internally, like discussing impacts of policy and how we might see long-term trends out of that. So it is worth going to our website and subscribing to that if you are not already, because it's a chance to see those those opinions of ours expressed concisely.
Thanks, Corin. There's a question there also from Anya, which is about do we envisage tracking infrastructure development and deployment alongside the EV uptake? I mean, I think that's again, just taking that very quickly, it's something we've talked about internally. There's a number of websites out there that show the deployment of charging infrastructure like ZapMap and others, and we sort of link to those. But it's certainly something I think that we definitely on at least a sort of quarterly basis, we look at how that tracks the EV deployments, especially the UK. We've got lots of detail on that, but globally it might be quite an interesting discussion to have. So it's certainly something.
Yeah, I think on top of that, it's also worth noting that that sort of as this is still is this an ever evolving situation, not even just in the UK but globally, that there's still a ways to go to have that sort of real-time access, I think, available to the likes of us. But it's something that certainly, as Harry said, we're very interested in, and we're always looking to find, because it's such a invaluable resource in doing uptake sort of analyses as well. But without consistent markers, it can be hard to 100% measure.
Indeed. We're coming to the end of the piece with some questions coming in. Simon, thank you for your question about insurance. I think that's something that's slightly longer term related to the EV rollout. We have some thoughts on that. We can probably get back to you on that one. Short answer would be yes. I mean, there are issues regarding EV insurance, but these are again, we're at the front end of this, and I think you've seen lots of solutions come out for every issue that's coming up. Charge point rollout data, absolutely something we're going to be working with, and as we've got this data for and as we've got the data coming in on a monthly basis, as we've been pointing out here, then we're looking at how that links to the infrastructure data as well. I just would point out the IEA the report again, not to give them a sort of plug, but if you look at the charge point data in the EU, for example, it is pretty strong related to targets. So I think that the infrastructure, as David pointed out earlier, there's often a little bit of gloomism about it, like, oh, there's not enough public charge points, etc., etc. That really isn't the story the IEA would tell you. So I think that we have got an uptick here. If you take out the seasonality, you look at the charge point infrastructure build, you look at China's kind of innovations, etc. You've got a lot of the drivers for very much, I think, the uptick that we're seeing in our data. So I think, I hope a takeaway there is that if you look at the trends, they're looking very strong. The day-to-day noise, okay, people will have their views, etc., etc. Choose your media outlet, etc. But we're seeing, if you look at the numbers behind all that, it's quite a strong trend, which I think was the main part of this presentation. I don't know, would anybody else? Is there any other? There's no more questions coming at the moment, and I'm conscious of time for everybody. David, Corin, Neha, is there anything else you would want to say before I start to wrap up? And we've got Sibu from GCSCC who wants to just say a word. 3, 2, 1. Excellent. I hope everybody, we're 2 minutes over time. Sibu from GCSCC, would you like to just make you're helping us with our communications and our delivery of all this information. So I'll pass to you, and then I'll finish things off.
Yeah, I'll take nothing more than 30 seconds. Thank you very much, everyone. My name is Sibu Mkwanazi from the Global Strategic Communication Council. I just want to let you know that we are a resource for journalists. If you're looking for any voices, spokespeople in the EV industry, let us know. Academics, any resource that will help you to write any of your content, or even on TV, we can definitely help you with that. Research, reports, academics, we are your people. My email address is smu.mkwanazi@gsccnetwork.org. I'll put it in the chat. But yeah, just wanted to say thank you very much for your time. I'll put my contact details in the chat and you can take it offline after this.
All right, thanks, Sibu. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for today. All feedback to general@newautomotive.org, as Corin mentioned. All the recordings, the links, the slides, the documents, etc., will be sent as a pack to everybody. I'm grateful for any sort of feedback that you can give. And this is obviously a quarterly. We'd be looking to do more of this, but we'd be keen to hear your ideas as to whether you'd want to see it more frequently or any other topics you'd want to be covered. Unless anybody else or anybody wants to say anything on the chat or from the team wants to say anything, I'll suggest that we would. Thank you very much for the comments coming in. Yeah, well done to the presenters. That was I learned a lot, which I shouldn't have done. I should have known all this, but that was great. And thanks so much for taking part and giving up your time for this. As I say, we'll pass all the notes to you, and all comments welcome. Thank you so much to everybody.
Thanks, Ben.